crazy day where at any second my staff is going to start jumping up and down. I texted my assistant, they're calling votes soon, so just let me know when it's like 10 minutes and we have to sprint to the Capitol. But I am so lifted. You all are rising and clapping for me. It should be the opposite way around. I have been in the trenches for all of my life, working on problems that most of America often doesn't want to necessarily confront, that don't make headlines at night. The struggles to just affirm human dignity and affirm love in our communities and in our society. When I was a young kid, I moved, just graduated, actually I was still going to law school, and I came down to Martin Luther King Boulevard in Newark, and you all know that Chris Rock's quote, who says, "Why is the most violent street in every city is often named for the man that stood for nonviolence." I moved on to a tough street in Newark, New Jersey, wanting to make a difference, because I had these parents who came from the 60s and fought in glorious battles and would never let me forget where I came from. I was one of these kids that, when I was 18 years old, I don't know if you have kids, anybody in this room, but your 18-year-olds do not have the kind of swagger that I had. I used to walk around like, I had done something with my life. And my father would look at me, and here I was, president of my high school class, all-American football player, and he would say things to me, "Boy, don't you dare walk around this house like you hit a triple, because you were born on third base." The truth is, the privileges I enjoy, even the house I grew up in, I was raised to know that they actually had to get a white couple to pose as my parents in order to buy a home, because at that point there was lots of real estate steering going on in northern New Jersey. And so around my dinner table, my parents would pound into my head that the battle for this nation is not over yet. We have not achieved ourselves. We have these vaunted ideals and principles that we say time and time again. We put our hands over our hearts and say the words liberty and justice for all, but those words are not statements of fact. They're statements of aspiration, and they demand from us the citizenry, a commitment above and beyond. There's a place in Memphis, Tennessee. There's a plaque that hangs that has a quote on it from the Torah and from the Bible, the Old Testament. I still remember the first time I saw that plaque. But there was another time I was standing in Israel looking at Mount Nebo. And the guides that I was with that were showing me around, I said, that mountain is so important in American context, because as those of you know, Mount Nebo was the place that Moses was allowed to ascend to the mountain and see the promised land. And he didn't get to go to the promised land. And I explained to these two great men in this desert overlooking a valley in the mountains, I said to them, that mountain was used in a speech by this great American named Martin Luther King. And I actually asked for the iPad from one of the guides, and I said to him, I'm going to play this speech. And I still remember it was at nighttime in the Israeli desert. They're listening to these words of Martin Luther King. I've been to the mountaintop. I have seen over. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will make it to the promised land. And you know how that speech ends? Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Well, he would go back to his hotel. And hours later, after waking up, he would be slain by an assassin's bullet. And the reason why I tell you that is because the plaque that I remember the first time I saw it, that sits there with words on it from the Torah, with words from the Old Testament, it says, "Behold," and these are words spoken by the brothers of Joseph when they saw Joseph coming. It says right there where King was slain, "Behold, here cometh the dreamer. Let us slay him and see what becomes of his dreams." And so this is the pain for me, and the anguish and the motivation for my professional life, is when my parents educate me about the generations of Americans who worked and struggled and fought to make a more perfect union, to make a better country, and they handed it over to me and my generation. The anguish that I feel was represented once by my father. You see, I didn't just go to Martin Luther King Boulevard, I moved in. I didn't just live on Martin Luther King, I lived in the high-rise projects. Lived there for 8 years. Towards the end I was living there, this public housing owned building, after a grievous, painful murder in the neighborhood. My father looks at me and says, son, I don't know what to say. I worry that a child born like me in 1936, poor. In fact, my father said he couldn't afford to be poor, he was just P.O., couldn't afford to be a child born like me, poor, black, to a single mother, would have a better chance of making it out of poverty in 36 than they would being born today. Now, I love data. When I was mayor of Newark, I used to always say, God we trust, I'm a man of faith, but everybody else bring me data. Show me the numbers. And the challenge is what my father said that anguished my heart. If you look at the data, it is very troubling. I had my staff pull some of these numbers for you, but you look at the areas that this country used to be number one in, and how we're slipping. We used to be the top country in the globe to be born poor in, because you could make it out of poverty. Now, social mobility and measurable indice, it's better to be born poor in Canada or England or Germany if your goal is to make it into the middle class than it is to be born in the United States. That's contrary to the very idea of the American dream. We used to be number one in high school. We've fallen 10 spots in terms of high school and college graduation rates. We used to be the top country in the globe for graduating people from college, percentage of our population. Now we've fallen dramatically. The Council for Foreign Relations report attributed the decline in these graduation rates, and I'm quoting here, to the deep and growing achievement gap between socioeconomic groups that begins and lasts through a student's career. In other words, if you have a nation where 14.5% of people overall are born poor, where more than 1 in 5 of our children are born poor, and please understand, it's gotten worse since 2008, where you see along racial lines that 27% of African Americans, 23% of Latinos are below the poverty line. And you know the data shows that poverty is quicksand. It's not rock bottom. It's quicksand that will pull at you and pull at you, that poor children have challenging environments. I used to try to get people to understand what my children have to overcome. This is why one of my favorite people, Booker T. Washington, used to always say, don't judge a person by how high they climb, but by the depths from which they had to rise. Because you all know that people who work hard and play by the rules get trapped. They do everything people say in a self-righteous manner that you people should do, and yet they cannot rise out of their circumstances because so much is being heaped on them. Look, I have these environmental fights. What does environmentalism have to do with this? Well, when my children in Newark, when I was mayor, couldn't do what people a century ago did when they were poor, they would just go to the river and fish, go clamming. But we allowed corporations and industry to pollute that river. Well, they used to be able to plant gardens. Did you know when I started urban agriculture in Newark, still to this day, if you were to drive through, we're the biggest urban agricultural city in the state, but we had to do it all in planter boxes above the ground because the soil was toxic. I was with the head of the EPA in Newark last week announcing air quality testing because 25% of my kids have asthma because of the air quality. What happens to a human being when you separate them completely from nature? The air they breathe, the water in their community, the land and the soil. And you see these obstacles that we place that are beginning to get so high. I was was on CNN today being interviewed by Dr. Sanjay Gupta, an incredible guy. He's too skinny. I only want to see overweight doctors because they don't preach to me enough about me. But I sat with Sanjay Gupta, and we were talking about an issue that I'm pressing hard with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and some others about just allowing sick people to have access to drugs that make them better. In this case, it's marijuana. Now, if you take out the THC of marijuana, it's not, it won't make it high. But if a mother has a kid that has got horrible epileptic seizures, literally hundreds of seizures in the span of a week, that could be the difference of life and death for that kid. And so we're talking about that, and we're going along making really good points, but I just couldn't avoid where I shouldn't have gone on an interview about medicine, because I had to talk about the fact that we have a criminal justice system as well. I talked about the environment. We also have a criminal justice system as well that is slanted deeply against poor people and helps to ingrain poverty. You all know this because, well, the environmental factors from lead paint and asthma, but here we have a situation where the last 3 presidents admitted to smoking marijuana. I would be willing to guess a quarter, a third of Congress people have. I'm not saying anything. This is not a confession. My staff are having heart attacks. Remember, this has been filmed, Cory. But my point is that there are certain communities in which the drug war is so intense that are usually poor communities. And actually, if you go to some cities, blacks and Latinos overall forget where they live. An African American young man, by the time they're 23, they have a 44% chance of being arrested because they're pulled over so many times. African Americans have almost a 4 times more likely chance of being arrested for marijuana possession than someone's white, even though there's no difference in usage. And so now you find yourself a 17-year-old kid growing up in a toxic environment. Your parents may not have had access